once you get to a certain position of authority, then people are supposed to do stuff for you, right? Once you get to be a leader, then yeah, everybody just serves you. If you get to be the boss at work, then it's your job to sit back and bark orders, and people will bring you coffee and will go buy you lunch and other things, right? And if you're a boss at work, that doesn't mean you ever have to clean up anymore. Now, those are all untrue things, right? I'm being sarcastic. That's the way the world looks at it. So, servanthood is something that we as spiritual leaders and spiritually influential people should all aspire to have, because the Bible is just slam full of examples of people that led with humility. They were never above helping other people. You never get to a point where you say, well, doing that is no longer my station. So servanthood isn't a class-based thing. It's not a upper or lower class type thing. It's something that we all need to do. So the purpose of this class is to look at what is servanthood from a spiritual perspective. Again, to Donnie's point, the world thinks about servanthood as a status thing. You know, think about, you know, you go to a hotel and you have people that go and clean the rooms and all that. It's not like you're only doing servant type things if you are a certain class in society. That's not it about all. So it's not about position or status or skill. And Jesus himself taught that if we want to be faithful to him, the greatest must become the least. So the more you want to lead people, the more you should serve them. And we should be able to go and surrender our own agenda so that we could put forth the agenda of the people that we're trying to serve and the people that we're trying to lead. And if we want to do that, we have to intentionally learn about people's needs and value those needs above our own and take action to meet those needs. So I think about two personal examples in my working time. You know, I had one manager who owned the place at a lodge I worked at. You know, he would often be cleaning up the kitchen, you know, mopping the floors, helping out with those type things. And he had specific things that he'd want to have cleaned and taken care of, but he would lead the way by often doing that one time a week. So nobody in the kitchen would complain about cleaning a fryer if the owner would go and clean the fryers once a week or so. You know, he'd say, I think this is important that we do this right, and it's important enough that I'm going to help out with it on an occasion. You know, so that's the owner of the place that will go and do some, what we might call menial work. But he wasn't above it. He didn't say, I'm the owner now, I'm hands off, I'm not going to touch that. Another example, one of the great plant managers I worked for was a big mentor. You know, he would plan a bit of an afternoon every week to go out on the shop floor and help clean things up. And, you know, I seen him out there, you know, took off his button-down shirt and was mopping the floor in a white t-shirt when there was a machine that flooded cooling all over the place. So he was out there mopping alongside, you know, just regular rank and file operators. And later on, he started an initiative where once a week we would shut down a set of machines and we'd have a handful of people from all over the plant go out there and do some deep cleaning and maintenance work to it. And, you know, he would get office people out there cleaning up the shop floor, but nobody complained. Well, people complained, but most people didn't complain because there was an example set by somebody who's willing to go out there and literally roll up his sleeves and get his hands dirty. So that's an example of what I've seen in, you know, servant leadership, you know, practical examples from my working time. But what motivates them? What should motivate us as spiritual leaders? It's not necessarily because we want to get out there and have the cleanest fryers around or anything like that, or have the cleanest floors around. We should be motivated spiritually by love and unselfishness. Again, we should serve people by putting their needs first and surrender our own needs and our own agenda to put others first. So it goes through a lot of humility. It takes a lot of thinking about others. So why is servanthood important if we want to be spiritual leaders? Why are we worrying about it in the first place? What happens if we try to influence people, but we are not having a servant attitude towards them? Donnie? exactly right. No, I mean, that's good. I mean, everybody's tired of hearing me talk. Speaking of which, Donnie's got the next quarter starting in October on Romans, right? So we'll be wrapping up this series in a few weeks, and get your thinking caps on for the class on Romans. It'll be a good, healthy challenge. But yeah, thanks for your comments, Donnie. So yeah, it goes back to Jesus being the ultimate example, and we need to serve God first. And if we truly serve God, and if we're truly acting through faith, that will motivate us to be serving others as well. If we do not have a servant-like attitude and we try to influence people, or we're trying to be a spiritual leader, what's going to be the result? People aren't going to be as willing to buy into things. You know, people might question motives. If you're the type that is too good to help do other things, people might be saying, well, why should I listen to them? If they aren't willing to help me with this, why should I listen to them on that? You know, we've got to go and humble ourselves and show that we're willing to do the work and not just go out there and, you know, point a finger or give orders or anything like that. So let's turn to our first character study. Let's turn to 1 Samuel chapter 30, and we'll read a passage about David when he is anointed but not yet king. So 1 Samuel chapter 30. We aren't going to read this entire chapter, but we're going to read some sections of verses. So I'm going to read verse 1 through 6 for the background. 1 Samuel 30, verses 1. Now when David and his men came to Ziklag on the third day, the Amalekites had made a raid against the Negeb and against Ziklag. They had overcome Ziklag and burned it with fire and taken captive the women and all who were in it, both small and great. They killed no one, but carried them off and went their way. So here comes those Amalekites again. And what do here? They go and they basically take families hostage. They carry away women and children. Verse 3, and when David and his men came to the city, they found it burned with fire, and their wives and sons and daughters taken captive. Then David and the people who were with him, raised their voices and wept, until they had no more strength to weep. They cried till they couldn't cry no more. Verse 5, David's two wives had also been taken captive, Ahinoam of Jezreel and Abigail, the widow of Nabal of Carmel. And David was greatly distressed, for the people spoke of stoning him, because all the people were bitter in soul, each for his sons and daughters. But David strengthened himself in the Lord his God. So the situation was so bad that David was afraid they were going to turn on him, right? And thought they were going to go and stone him because of this failure to protect the families while the fighting men were away. For the sake of time, let's skip down to verse 9 and pick up there. So they had counsel to go and pursue the Amalekites. They were assured victory when David conferred with Abiathar the priest. Verse 9, so David set out, and the 600 men who were with him, and they came to the brook Bezor, where those who were left behind stayed. But David pursued, he and 400 men. 200 stayed behind, and who were too exhausted to cross the brook Bezor. So they set off on pursuit, David and 600 men. Along the way, remember, these guys have been fighting for a while. This was a series of battles, and so a lot of them were just worn out. 2 of them didn't have the strength to go on, so they stayed back. 4 of them continued. So they split their force by a third. 200 stayed behind, 400 went on. So remember that fact. All right, they come upon an Egyptian who says he knows where they are. He will guide them. Let's pick up in verse 16. And when David, had taken him, this Egyptian helper guy, behold, they were spread abroad all over the land, eating and drinking and dancing, because of all the great spoil they had taken from the land of the Philistines and from the land of Judah. So the Amalekites are camped out and celebrating here. And David struck them down from twilight until the evening of the next day, and not a man of them escaped, except 400 young men who mounted camels and fled. And David recovered all that the Amalekites had taken, and David rescued his 2 wives. Nothing was missing, whether small or great, sons or daughters, spoil or anything that had been taken. David brought it all back all. David also captured all the flocks and herds, and the people drove the livestock before them and said, "This is David's spoil." So far, so good. The 400 men that remained caught up with the Amalekites, found them camped out and celebrating, and they were able to go and take over, and they reclaimed all that was taken. So their women, children, sons, daughters, where they were all safe. I'm sure traumatized, but physically safe. So let's read about the aftermath then and see how David handles the situation. Picking up in verse 21. Then David came to the 200 men who had become too exhausted to follow David, who had been left at the brook Bezor. And they went out to meet David and to meet the people who were with him. And when David came near to the people, he greeted them. So they're on the way back. They meet the 200 people they've been left behind. The fighting forces reunited. Verse 22. Then all the wicked and worthless fellows among the men who had gone with David said, "Because they did not go with us, we will not give them any of the spoil that we have recovered, except that each man may lead away his wife and children and depart." But David said, "You shall not do so, my brothers, with what the Lord has given us. He has preserved us and given into our hand the band that came against us. Who would listen to you in this matter? For as his share is who goes down into the battle, so shall his share be who stays by the baggage. They shall share alike." And he made it a statute and a rule for Israel from that day forward to this day. So, once everybody's reunited, what happened? Some of the guys that went on and did the fighting wanted to keep all the shares of the spoil of war and not give any to the 200 guys that stayed behind. So David says, we aren't going to go and do that. We're going to share with everybody, even the guys that got left behind. And so he stood up for his guys, and he was looking out for them. So let's go to the study questions and talk through that. And think about what did David do differently in standing up for the guys that got left behind that a non-follower of God would have done? What would a secular king have done to those guys versus David, who was following God? So question 1. Do you consider David's decision to share the plunder equally to be fair and just, or generous and indulgent? What do we think about his decision to share the plunder with everybody, and not just the 2/3 that went fighting? What do you think about David's decision? Yep. Yep. Fair, just, and generous. Yep. So why would that be fair to share the plunders with 1/3 of the fighting force that didn't make it to the battle? I think a couple things. And I know I didn't get this sheet of questions out in last week, so forgive me for that. But when we started this lesson, we talked about putting people's needs above their own and being able to put yourself in their shoes, in other words. So David knew that the 200 guys that stayed behind, they would have gone on to the fight if they could. They had been fighting before. They'd been through a series of battles. They were worn out. We don't know if they were injured or what. Also, it was their families that were taken too. Those 200 guys had, women, children, sons that were taken also. So they had a vested interest in the fight. So I don't think that they stayed behind for, selfish means. They weren't trying to dodge a fight. They had been through the fighting, and they still performed a task. So David said that they stayed behind the baggage. They're kind of guarding their supply chain, if you will. Making sure that no one could come behind them and raid them. And again, they would have joined the fight if they could have. So David knew what they would have done, and David looked out for his guys. He had a loyalty to them. One of the things that David and his fighting force is he always had a long-term loyalty to his guys. They've been through a lot. They've been through many years of hiding, many years of having a separate kingship before they moved to Jerusalem. And later on, in the Chronicles, read about David and his mighty men, David and his special 30 mighty men. So he was a very hands-on leader. So they were loyal to him. He was loyal to them. And he remembered their history together, and he looked out for them. So he was being generous, and he knew, that's how a lot of the fighters got paid too. They didn't have the same kind of tax system that we have, but often their battles would be their paycheck when they got the spoils of war. So question 2, what might have motivated David to make that decision? I already mentioned some of that, but let's take it a step further. What motivated David to make that decision? Yep. Yep. Yeah, so to Larry's point, I think David knew that the guys are at their limit. He's not going to push them and break them and start having people die of exhaustion. But being a military leader, he had a practical plan for them to guard and defend. So that's some really good big picture thinking about how to manage the unit. Aaron? Yep. Yeah, exactly the right point. So David remembered where the victory came from, right? And so everyone could hear, summary of Aaron's comments. God gave the victory. David remembered that. And David is thinking, who am I to go and hold back some of the awards from the victory that God gave? Verse 23 is the key verse. David says, you shall not do so, my brothers. He calls these guys his brothers. He didn't say, I'm in charge around here. You need to, know your role and all that. He called them brothers. He answered logically. And this is Aaron's point here. David says, you shall not do so, my brothers, with what the Lord has given us. He has preserved us and given into our hand the band that came against us. So, again, Aaron made the exact right point that God gave the victory, and David recognized that and realize that he needs to go and be a good steward of what they were rewarded with and not be selfish or, distribute that in a way that would cause further consternation later on. So David also sent some of the spoils to the elders of Judah. We didn't read that in verse 26. But I think one of the things that David shows when he shares the spoils with the elders too, it's kind of sending the message that all of God's faithful win when the enemies of God are defeated. When the enemies of God are defeated, some people might benefit more than others if you're, close to where that enemy is, but ultimately we all gain when God has a victory. So other further comments on this. So if we skip down to the fourth question, how would you describe David's leadership skill and style in this passage? We'll move on for the lack of time, but I think that he shows good practical management with how he distributes his guys. But most of all, he shows a lot of empathy for them, and he shows a lot of humility in giving God the credit, not trying to take the credit on his own. So we got about 20 minutes left in class. I want to move on to the next case study, unless there's any more discussion on King David here. I don't see any hands. Let's turn to Luke chapter 10 and read the passage about the Good Samaritan. Luke chapter 10. I'm trying to talk and turn pages at the same time, and I'm way off. Luke chapter 10. Beginning of verse 25. And behold, a lawyer stood up to put him to the test, saying, Teacher, what shall I do to inherit eternal life? And he said to him, What is written in the law? How do you read it? And he answered, You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your strength, and with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself. And he said to him, You have answered correctly. Do this, and you will live. It's a test, but so far so good, right? Verse 29, But he, desiring to justify himself, said to Jesus, And who is my neighbor? So a lawyer, of course, is going to try and find a loophole, right? Verse 30, and Jesus replied, A man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho, and he fell among the robbers, who stripped him and beat him and departed, leaving him half dead. Now by chance a priest was going down that road, and when he saw him, he passed by on the other side. So likewise a Levite, when he had come to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side. But a Samaritan, as he journeyed, came to where he was, and when he saw him, he had compassion. He went to him and bound up his wounds, pouring on oil and wine. Then he set him on his own animal and brought him to an inn and took care of him. And the next day he took out 2 denarii and gave them to the innkeeper, saying, Take care of him, and whatever more you spend, I will repay you when I come back. Which one of these 3 do you think proved to be a neighbor to the man who fell among the robbers? He said, The one who showed him mercy. And Jesus said to him, You go and do likewise. So I think one of the more famous examples we have of total servanthood, the servanthood where there is, really no selfish motivation for the Samaritan to help somebody who is one of his, ancestral and tribal enemies. Remember how the Samaritans and the Jews couldn't stand each other. So we have a good example of servant leadership from the Samaritan, and we have a terrible example of servant leadership from the lawyer. What did the lawyer do that made him a poor example of servanthood? He was trying to find a loophole, right? He says, well, who is my neighbor? Before I have to go and show love to somebody, let's first narrow that down a little bit. I hope that Jesus is going to say, my neighbor is not these people that I don't like over here. Definitely not those people I don't like over there. I don't have to be a neighbor to them. I don't have to show love to them. I could justify myself. What does it mean if you're trying to justify yourself? Make yourself look good. It's also making excuses when you know you aren't doing something right. So if you go and you do something wrong, you hurt somebody, instead of owning it and taking accountability, you say, oh, well, I meant to do something different. We hear that in the kids all the time. One kid kicked the other. Did you kick him or not? Well, yes or no. You do it or you don't. So that's justifying himself. We see kids do it. We've got to make sure that we don't do that in terms of servant leadership. So question 1, what was the expert in the law trying to achieve with his dialogue? And what was the actual outcome? Well, he was trying to test Jesus. He's trying to justify himself, make excuses, and define some limits on the things that he didn't really want to do. As a result, he was really humbled, and Jesus corrected him and took away love your neighbor. So question 2, I'm trying to move through this briskly. Question 2 says, in this parable, why did Jesus choose a priest and a Levite to be the ones who passed the injured man? And what kind of point can we learn from this? Why a priest and a Levite? Exactly. The priest and Levite should have known better, right? They should have set the example. But not only do they walk by, they do what when they walk by? Other side of the road. What does that tell you? They're trying to get some further separation. They're trying to go and look the other way and claim ignorance and, taking a wide path around. But yeah, as Larry says, they should have known better. They should have set the example. They should have been the leaders that show through their action what servanthood is. Yes, sir. Mhm. Yep. So you take that priest and Levite, and to Donnie's point, substitute more modern situations. How would you feel if that was a preacher, elder, or deacon walking by the other side of the road and turning a blind eye? So question 3, when Jesus asked the expert in the law who acted like a neighbor, the man responded that it was a person who was merciful. How much does mercy or compassion come into play for servanthood? What's the role in compassion and mercy and servanthood? Mhm. Yeah. So you said something like you got to put yourself in an uncomfortable situation. Yeah. One needs to follow the other, right? You got to have that compassion and mercy. One, so you act with the right action. So Larry said sometimes you put yourself in an uncomfortable situation. This Samaritan gave coin from his own pocket for the guy that was injured. Sometimes you don't get anything, you give, you don't get. And that's fine because we have to have that priority where we aren't doing things for personal or material or selfish reasons. It's not a for-profit transaction. And our primary motivation should be their own well-being, physical and spiritual. So we have to have mercy and compassion so we're willing to give of ourselves, and also compassion often when we have the opportunity to serve, we need to do that without any sort of judgment. You can't go by and say, well, I'm going to help you out, but I'm going to go and give you a lecture. Sometimes that's needed if a person's in a state of sin, but often giving a lecture at that time is going to do more harm than good. So you need to go and help people without passing any sort of, judgment or saying you aren't worthy of my help or anything like that. Larry? Right. And that's a worldly attitude we got to watch out for, right? What's in it for me, basically. It's like, before I help you, I got to figure out what am I going to get out of it. But that takes away all the personal motivation. And how would somebody be inspired to follow somebody spiritually if they are served in a way that there is a contract or strings attached to it? That takes away all the spiritual impact and it turns it into just a regular material transaction. So again, when we serve people, we might serve them physically in order to show spiritual love for them. And while we need to look out for everybody's well-being. Ultimately, we want to help somebody's well-being so that they're in a better place to serve spiritually. Often people might be so consumed with what's going on that they don't have much capacity to think in terms of spiritual things. It's just, taking all their attention. So ultimately, if anybody serves spiritually or serves physically, it should be so that we show our love in a spiritual sense also. Comments on that before we move on to the next example? Donnie? Yep, and that's a good way to look at it. So that just totally flips that question around. Donnie says, so good to hear. Instead of asking, who is my neighbor, we need to ask ourselves, am I being a good neighbor? Good point. All right, let's turn to John chapter 13 and read the last study for this morning. The third one always ends up being a lot more condensed. So John chapter 13, Jesus washes the disciples' feet. I'm going to pick up in verse 3. Jesus, knowing that the Father had given all things into his hands, and that he had come from God and was going back to God, rose from supper. He laid aside his outer garments, and taking a towel, tied it around his waist. Then he poured water into a basin and began to wash the disciples' feet, to wipe them with a towel that was wrapped around him. He came to Simon Peter, who said to him, Lord, do you wash my feet? Jesus answered him, what am I doing you do not understand now, but afterwards you will understand. Peter said to him, you shall never wash my feet. Jesus answered him, if I do not wash you, you have no share with me. Simon Peter said to him, Lord, not my feet only, but also my hands and my head. Jesus said to him, the one who has bathed does not need to wash except for his feet, but is completely clean. And you are clean, but not every one of you. For he knew who was to betray him. That's why he said, not all of you are clean. When he had washed their feet and put on his outer garments and resumed his place, he said to them, do you understand what I have done to you? You call me teacher and Lord, and you are right, for so I am. If I then, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet. For I have given you an example that you also should do just as I have done to you. Truly, truly, I say to you, a servant is not greater than his master, nor is a messenger greater than the one who sent them. So this example is pretty direct. Jesus doesn't leave too much unsaid here when he gives this example. So let's just get to the questions. We got about 6 minutes left. So why did Jesus wash his disciples' feet? What was his reason for that? Yep, giving the example. So if Jesus does it, who are we to say that we're too good to do that and to say that that's beneath me? And Jesus shows humility, he shows servanthood, and he shows that there's no limit. You don't ever graduate away from serving people. Going back to examples of, not saying that I'm too good to be doing these tasks. That's for other people, not me. We can't ever have that kind of attitude when it comes to serving. Question 2. How much of serving as a leader involves the ability to trade places either physically or emotionally with the people we lead? Yep. Those are good points. A lot of good points in there. So we got to be able to relate to people, to understand their needs. If we're going to serve people, you got to know where they're coming from. You got to know how they're hurting and think about what a good solution would be to help. And, talk to them. Don't just assume. And then Larry also makes a good point about seeking advice or counsel. You know, David went to the priest when he was getting counsel on whether to pursue the Amalekites. Same thing here. We got to make sure that we pray, we contemplate, we talk to others, we talk to the people that we want to help, and not just go and do anything, you know, based off assumption or anything. So good points there. But you got to be able to relate. You got to be able to understand what they need so that you can provide the right needs, or you can provide the right solutions, rather. You want to just make assumptions. Two, when you connect with people on that level too, again, going back to the spiritual impact, you don't want to just go and deliver a physical good and that be that. You want to be able to make sure you are supporting them spiritually and making sure that they, feel like they are receiving love. Question 3. How did Jesus' understanding of himself and who he was help him to serve others? So Jesus, knowing who he was, how did that help him to serve? Well, I think two things. We have to know, one, we have to know our abilities. Jesus knew that he had the ability to go and wash feet, but he also had other abilities that we. Similarly, some of us might have abilities that others don't. Larry and I might be able to go two different sets of things for people, but we can't do the same things in a lot of ways. We got different abilities, different ways to serve. But two, Jesus also knew that he was very influential. He knew that people looked up to him. He knew that he was a leader. And there's a certain time when you're a leader, there's certain things that you can't not do because people are watching you. So if I'm, a silly example, if I'm walking through one of our plants with some people that I have influence over, and I step over some fluid without telling anybody, that somebody might slip in, or if I don't pick up trash, people see what you do and what you don't do. You have the ability to influence people with their actions and what they see. So you got to realize, you got to understand your ability to influence and what kind of, sphere of influence you got around you. So I think Jesus realized that people were always watching him, always seeing his example. They see what he did and what he didn't do. And if you're ever in a situation like the Good Samaritan, if you don't do something that you should do, people see that also. If people see you skirt by and look the other way when you have the opportunity to serve, people see that, and that'd be a negative example that you want to avoid. Closing comments, questions, thoughts. Donnie? Yep. Little things like that can make a big difference. So I hope what we could take away from this class is we all need to be servants. We all need to be servant leaders, look for ways to go and serve the people that we want to influence. Because without a servant mindset, our relationships are going to be more transactional. It's going to be more about what can we do, what can we get out of this, instead of what can we do to show the love of Christ for everybody. Appreciate everybody's comments and discussion this morning. Thanks for class.